meeting, I know that there's representation from a lot of organisations who are working in the field, and hopefully we can work together to move things forward in relation to the Magnitsky sanctions request that we'll be discussing during the course of the meeting. You've seen the flyer. I'm not going to introduce the speakers right now, but I will introduce them as we go along. Sadly, both Kirsty Brimelow of Doughty Street Chambers and Melanie Gingell of the Gulf Centre for Human Rights have been struck down by various viruses, but we're lucky to have Josie from Bahrain Institute for Human Rights and Democracy to replace them, and she's going to be talking about some actual cases that are happening in Bahrain at the moment, which are relevant to the request for the Magnitsky sanctions. So I have to thank Andy Slaughter, a long-standing friend of Bahrain, for organising the room. But I'm just going to start off with a few words to explain why we're having this event tonight. It's only a week or so since the Prime Minister gave a talk about how he was going to export refugees to Rwanda for processing and resettlement. Now, that might not seem relevant to Bahrain, but one of his questions was, well, what's the alternative? And I suppose that one of the alternatives is to take a different approach to countries like Bahrain. I know that there's at least one refugee in the room, and Bahrain, although a small country, generates a number of people seeking asylum around the world. And tonight is about launching a report that was the idea of Khalid Ibrahim, of the Gulf Centre for Human Rights. But the people behind that report who inspired him to think about this report and this initiative are three refugees whose stories are told. They're fairly gruesome stories, and we've tried to tone them down. They're told in the report that you can find online and that will be translated into Arabic, and they are in France and in Ireland rather than the UK. And of course, there are other witnesses that we've spoken to in Bahrain, and we couldn't tell their stories in person because of the potential risk to them, although they wish to tell the stories. And Josie will touch on some of those tonight. So for me, tonight is the story of my last 11 years since the Arab Spring and the Bahrain uprising and the Olympics in 2012, when I was first lucky enough to start working with organisations like BIRD and the Gulf Centre for Human Rights to advise them on the struggle for accountability. And the report talks about the different methods that we've tried using legal mechanisms in the UK to bring those in Bahrain to account for egregious human rights abuses. So we started gently with UN complaints, which are useful for putting a spotlight, putting pressure on in cases like Nabil Rajab, for example. And then we were working with Kirsty Brimelow QC to attempt to bring Prince Nasser of Bahrain to criminal justice, and we managed to persuade the court that he should not be immune from prosecution, but we weren't able to have witnesses in person to give evidence against him because they are still in jail in Bahrain, and therefore we weren't able to mount a criminal prosecution. We also tried to exclude the prince from the UK using immigration sanctions, which are discussed in the report, but the court decided that whether or not they considered those could be kept secret because of data protection rules. And now we're planning to try to persuade the Foreign Office to use Magnitsky sanctions, and we're going to hear from Megan in a minute about how those work. So I hope that you'll read our report. It's on the Dighton Pearce Glyn, my solicitor's firm website, and it will be on the Gulf Centre for Human Rights websites, both in English and Arabic, once it's translated, and if you can't manage the full 35 pages, there's an executive summary of a couple of pages at the start, which explains what our conclusions are based on the witness evidence that we've heard. And I thought we should start tonight by hearing from Khalid Ibrahim, who is the executive director and co-founder of the Gulf Center for Human Rights. He has some words from one of those witnesses who wasn't able to travel here tonight, but whose story is told in part in our report. We were proud to be able to collaborate with him in, first of all, preparing all the material for the report and considering how we might try a new method of accountability, and also in organising this event with some EU funding to discuss that with you and hopefully get some further report for the initiative. So over to Khalid.
Thank you, Sue. Good evening. Thank you for taking time to attend this meeting. Thanks to MP Andy Slaughter for his efforts on Bahrain and for organizing this peaceful room for us. I have to read first the statement sent to me by human rights defender and torture survivor Ibrahim al-Dimistani, who has participated in this project but was unable to attend. His wife is very sick and he needed to stay with her. He writes, "I am a human rights defender, a nurse, and used to be the Secretary General of the Bahrain Nursing Society. My son Ali was killed during the 2011 protest. I was arrested on 17th of March 2011 and served a 3-year sentence for allegedly hiding and harboring a fugitive. The charge related to my treatment of a protester who was severely injured during a demonstration in the village of Garzagan on 14th of March 2011. I was subjected to torture and forced to witness the torture of my colleague, Dr. Ali Al-Akri and Rula Safar. And I forced to sign false statements. On 13th of October 2013, 3 medics, including myself, sent a letter from Joe prison outlining the conditions of our detention and our intention to set up an independent body of medics for human rights. The other 2 were arrested also during the 2011 protests and faced a trial on fabricated charges. We assert in this letter that our only crime is the protection of medical neutrality. The other 2 were Hassan Marzouk, an emergency department nurse at the Suleimaniya Medical Complex and a volunteer with the Bahrain Nursing Society, and Dr. Ali Al-Akri, a pediatric orthopedic surgeon. They just inform you that even in prison, our peaceful human rights work never stopped. Bahrain's purported efforts to investigate and prosecute security personnel and officials have been seriously inadequate. The court acquitted the defendants on all counts. Now I want to talk about the officer who tortured me, Mubarak bin Abdullah bin Huwail. Following his acquittal and fully clearing, he met with the Prime Minister at the time, Khalifa bin Salman Al Khalifa, who died in 2020, as reflected in a video recording of the meeting posted on YouTube. Al-Mari, the officer who tortured me, told the Prime Minister, "When issues get big, you are the one with a solution." In response, the Prime Minister said, "You know those laws. Nobody could apply them to you. No one can touch this bond between us. Whoever applies these laws against you applies them to us. We are one body." He was at that time a captain, but now he is a brigadier, Mubarak bin Huwail. Al-Mari, currently the secretary attaché at the Bahrain embassy in Riyadh. That shows how perpetrators of torture are protected and promoted in Bahrain. As for me, the victim, I did not get treatment from the doctor specialized in treating my spine. They sent me to a non-specialist doctor who relied on painkillers and sedatives, not treatment. This confirms the lack of seriousness in dealing with cases of torture and those affected by it. At the time when Ben Houel was free, I was forced by authorities targeting of me to flee my country. All this clearly shows the deep-rooted practice of torture and culture of impunity in Bahrain. None of these victims, survivors, or their families have had access to justice nor redress. People who inflicted physical and psychological pain upon them are free, and they have faced no punishment. Ensuring adequate and effective remedies for these victims and survivors is a human duty and responsibility. They should be held accountable for those ongoing crimes of human rights violations and sanctioned by using the Magnitsky Act. Thank you a lot to human rights lawyer, Lou Willman. Thanks to her assistant, the very hard working lawyer. Thanks to the Gulf Center for Human Rights for initiating such a much needed project. Thank you all, Ibrahim Demistani. Now it's my speech, so good evening again. Those were really very powerful words from one brave, courageous human rights defender. I know him for long years. Among many who were tortured in Bahrain, the Gulf Center for Human Rights has been working extensively in Bahrain since its establishment in 2011 and has clearly noted the prevalence of the culture of immunity and the lack of accountability in Bahrain and also in the neighboring countries such as Saudi Arabia. We continue to seek justice, medical treatment and freedom for my close colleague and co-founder of the Gulf Center for Human Rights, Abdelhadi Khawaja, who was severely tortured and required about 37 surgical interventions, as well as a large number of other human rights activists and prisoners of conscience. In all of these cases, justice was not achieved. And there are many cases where the court issued a verdict of acquittal against the perpetrators of crime of torture, such as you heard, the case of human rights defender Ibrahim Demistani or the journalist Naziha Saeed, who complained against the policewoman who tortured her. As a result, the court cleared the policewoman from all the charges, while Naziha, this young journalist, hard-working journalist, was continuously persecuted to the level that she was forced to leave Bahrain and live in exile. That's another case. So after witnessing all of these happening in Bahrain, in addition to other countries of the Middle East region, and knowing the fact that there are no legal remedies, prompted us at Gulf Center for Human Rights to seek the use of the concept of international jurisdiction in order to achieve justice. We started our work abroad in 2015 with Dayton Pierce Glenn solicitors acting for GCHR and a high court challenge the British government over service to prisons in Saudi Arabia, Oman, and Bahrain. We succeed, and these services stopped. Then GCHR, represented also by Dayton Pierce Glynn and 11 Kings bench walk, appeared in the High Court in 2018 to challenge the UK Prime Minister over the unexplained deletion from the UK Ministerial Code of the overarching duty to comply with the international law. Then we started this project in 2018. The project focused on accountability for torture in Bahrain, which included the possible use of Magnitsky sanctions. We have also submitted have submitted 4 cases before other foreign judiciary under the concept of global or under the concept of universal jurisdiction. 2 cases were submitted in France and Turkey against Major General Ahmed Nasser al-Raisi, the president of Interpol, for his involvement in the torture of my colleague, Ahmed Mansour. Ahmed Mansour is my colleague. He is serving now 10 years in UAE for tweets. He was tortured as well. And this general who is heading the Interpol, he is the General Inspector of the Ministry of Interior in UAE. So surely he has involvement in this. He joined the police force in UAE in 1980, all these years. And we hear a lot of stories of torture in UAE, and he did nothing. Still, he is not taking any action. So we submitted this case against him. We also submitted a case in France against NSO Group, which produced the Pegasus spyware. This spyware has been used to hack into the account of many of my colleagues, human rights defenders from Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and the UAE, such as Tissam al-Sair, Yahya al-Asiri, Hale, Ahid Dib, and Ala al-Siddiq. In actual fact, Ahmed Mansour, my colleague from UAE, he was the first victim of Pegasus in 2015. His story is very famous. Just Google it. Google his name, Ahmed Mansour, and you will see it. Back to the speech, we have also submitted a case in France against Saudi Major General Ahmed Hassan Mohammed al-Asiri, long name, but a close confidant and advisor to the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman for his role in the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. The murder of Jamal Khashoggi will tell you the brutality of our governments. This man, he went to the consulate, the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. He didn't go for a protest or to give his views. He just wanted to get a permission to get married from his fiancée, a Turkish citizen. They told him at the time he used to live in D.C., in Washington, D.C., writing articles for Washington Post. They told him, we can't give you permission here, you have to go to Istanbul. So he went into the consulate and disappeared. We know nothing, but we know that they killed him. So that is the brutality of our oppressive governments, to this level. Back to the speech, we will continue on this path, and surely we have many other cases that we will be taking up in the near future using foreign judiciaries. Finally, I have to thank my colleague, prominent human rights lawyer, Sue Willman, and also I have to thank her assistant, a young lawyer, I can't name him. Really, he's a very hardworking person. All your team, they are really so keen to achieve human rights changes in our countries. And also I have to thank you for your support and for making time to attend this meeting. Thank you so much.
People like you are a strong motivation to carry on doing this kind of work. Our next speaker has been invited for 3 reasons. One is that he's a lawyer and he's the Shadow Solicitor General. He's also the Labour MP for Hammersmith. He's been representing the people of West London, which has a large refugee and migrant community, for a very long time, representing them effectively, but that hasn't stopped him speaking out about the Middle East, about Palestine, and about the Gulf. He is deputy chair of the all-party parliamentary group on human rights and democracy in the Gulf, and he's advocated in many cases for people from that region and on issues for that region. So over to you, Andy Slaughter.
Thank you. 1 minute. Sorry, Andy.
Sue, thank you very much. It's lovely to see people here, both people I know and those I'm meeting for the first time. And there's a lot of expertise in the room, so I'm not going to show off my ignorance. I should say, yes, I am a lawyer, yes, I am at the moment Shadow Solicitor General, but I'm here just as more in the all-party parliamentary group capacity, and certainly not speaking on behalf of the Labour Party or any other party, speaking on behalf of myself. So I'll limit my remarks to just perhaps talking about how Parliament has or can help the struggle for human rights and democracy in Bahrain. It is something which, perhaps on and off, because we all tend to spread ourselves too thinly and to take an interest, even in the human rights field, there is so much to cover across the world that there's only a certain amount of time that can be spent on any one issue. But I guess I've been an MP since 2005, but it's probably, as many things go back to the Arab Spring that got me interested in the subject of Bahrain. I'd done a lot of work on other issues, human rights issues for that, including, as Sue said, on Palestine, which is another area of particular interest. But those two and I go back many years before that to Hammersmith and the Law Centre there, and to many other issues. And you couldn't have a better friend or a more experienced lawyer to advise and support you on these issues. And yes, obviously, there were issues before the Arab Spring in Bahrain, but of course the Arab Spring did draw, not just in Bahrain, but across the Arab world, a lot of attention to what was happening, partly in any event, and partly as a response to the freedom movements that occurred there, not obviously just in Bahrain, other Gulf countries, in Egypt, in Tunisia, across the Arab world, and with some extraordinarily dramatic and tragic consequences, as we've seen, particularly in Syria. But in Bahrain, it appeared until because of what happened at the Pearl Roundabout, that matters were positive until the crackdown came. And I think at that stage, and partly through Bird and other organisations, I and others here were alerted to what was going on there, and the fact that things were, from what had seemed quite a hopeful situation, were now going very badly. But what we were also aware of, and again, not just in Bahrain, that there were a number of MPs here and a number of all-party groups which, rather than representing the positive side of human rights and democracy, were actually colluding with the oppressive regimes. And I think Bahrain was probably unique in that there were two parallel groups. There was an all-party group on Bahrain, which was essentially apologists for the Al-Khalifas, whereas there was also the Democracy in Bahrain, as it was then called, group that I chaired for a while, that was trying to not just expose what was happening and raise these issues here, but also point out that some of our colleagues were colluding this. And there were not lots, but there were a number of MPs who would go on all expenses paid trips to the Gulf and things of that kind, I say, from a number of countries. Anyway, time went on. I think we hopefully gained more attention and the upper hand, and so I'm now the vice chair rather than the chair, but the group morphed into the all-party group on democracy in the Gulf, on the human rights in the Gulf. So we don't only cover Bahrain. But let me say something very positive, which is that in terms of raising human rights issues, the Bahrain opposition punches above its weight, very much so. If you look at, it may not seem that, but if you look back, you go back and look through Hansard, but in both houses, both House Commons and the Lords, you will have seen a number of debates specifically on this issue, with quite a number of MPs from different parties taking part. And that isn't always the case. It isn't always the case with other countries in the GCC, for example. Yes, there's quite a lot of attention on Saudi, not just for the reasons that have been given in relation to some of the murders and abuses by the regime there, but particularly, obviously, the war in Yemen. And Saudi is clearly a much bigger country and a much bigger issue. And there is some more focus now, quite rightly, I think, on UAE and what is going on there. But for the size of country that it is, and the attention which it's previously had, that Bahrain has certainly got quite a lot of attention here. And that's right, because it has allowed us to focus on some of the very specific abuses there. But it's also allowed us to focus on the very close relationships between the British state and the regime in Bahrain, which goes up to the highest levels, even into the royal family, in which both the defence establishment here and also the and foreign affairs and indeed the Prime Minister and others are very keen to cooperate and collaborate with the Bahraini regime. And it introduces that well-known concept of double standards, which we've seen particularly, and one of the things in which there is general agreement across parties and across the House is the response to what's happening in Ukraine. And that's quite right, because the human rights abuse that are occurring there, and the atrocities that are committed, and the aggression that is thrown, the war of aggression that's been started there, absolutely need to be condemned. And yet there is no read across. There's no read across to say, well, hang on, if occupation is wrong in the Crimea, what about occupation on the West Bank? If human rights abuses, war crimes, crimes against humanity are rightly being flagged in Ukraine, why are they not being flagged in other countries? Why are they not being flagged in Yemen? And why are we not talking about, and to a large extent, it is both those close personal ties in terms of individuals, but also economic ties and strategic military ties. You know, naval bases, armed forces cooperation, training the Bahraini security forces, that sort of reciprocal two-way process that we have drawn attention to many times here, whereby we will both offer, I say the UK government, will offer support and advice to prison systems, to security services, to the police, etc., almost as a part of our aid mission, and at the same time we will take money from the Bahrainis in terms of investment and buying services from here. It's a very close and interlinked, and it's difficult to disentangle. But there are signs of that, and I think it's quite right. I'll shut up in a second because I say there are people with rather more expertise than me who are going to speak next. But in terms of Magnitsky sanctions, I think that's quite important for two reasons. One is that Dominic Raab, the former Foreign Secretary, now Justice Secretary, has made a big thing about when criticisms have been made of the government's human rights record, quite appropriately enough. He has often said, yes, but I'm the person who introduced Magnitsky sanctions. Well, I think other people deserve some credit. Bill Browder might deserve some credit for that, who's done probably more than to get Magnitsky legislation passed around the world than anyone else. But certainly they hang their hat on that as something which they say is the positive that's being done. So I think that is we can call their bluff, we can challenge them in relation to that. But the other issue is, and insofar as individuals have been, and I think I can see why they choose to highlight that rather than wider sanctions against regimes, because they feel those wider sanctions will either impair those defence and other economic links they have with countries, whereas Magnitsky sanctions are essentially on individuals. And so, for example, we saw a number being imposed on some of the people accused of collusion in the murder of Khashoggi, not necessarily all the right people or the people at the highest levels, but nonetheless that they were imposed. It's easier in a way to do that, and I think it's appropriate in the case of Bahrain, because in often cases there are individuals who can be identified as being responsible for torture, responsible for the policies that have led to the situation there. But they will also be individuals who have close relationships with the UK, who come to the UK, who perhaps have property, perhaps have assets, perhaps simply recreate here. So I think this could be quite a valuable weapon. How easy is it going to be? Final point, not very easy. This is a curious day in Parliament. We're going to be here till about 2 o'clock in the morning, we think, because we're in something called ping pong, whereby bills which are shot down in the House of Lords go back to the House of Commons and are revived there because of the government majority. And those are bills like the Nationalities and Borders Bill, which is being discussed at this very moment, like the Police Bill, which prevents peaceful protests, like the Judicial Review Bill, which I was dealing with earlier today, which fetters the judiciary and prevents them calling out abuses by the government, and many others. This is, in many ways, the most reactionary government we have had, certainly in my political lifetime. That is saying something. If we go back to the Thatcher years, so on and so forth. There is a whole litany of legislation, and human rights are the very low priority, and things like the Rwanda scheme show that the government is prepared either for self-serving reasons, political reasons, or because it has no scruples or morals on these issues, is prepared to go further than even previous Conservative governments had. So no, it's not easy, But yes, this I think is the right approach. Yes, this report is an excellent report, and I'm very pleased to be here as part of the launch of it. And I will continue to do what I can through the channels here in Parliament to support what you are doing, the real work that you are doing out in the community, out with the media, with lawyers and so forth, to ensure that we do make steps. So thank you very much for coming tonight. You're very welcome here. I will be quiet now and listen to some rather more elevated and well-informed speakers. Yeah.
Thank you, Andy. You're very modest, as always, and we will be coming back to you for support when we put in our request to the Foreign Office for sanctions. So now we're handing over to, you gave us a good lead-in in relation to whether or not Magnitsky sanctions are going to happen and how the government's going to respond to them. If there's one organisation in the UK that knows about torture, then it's Redress, which was founded by a torture survivor and has grown since then to provide a source of advocacy, challenging torture around the world, and providing information and representation in the UK. And so we're very lucky to have Megan Smith. She's probably the expert on Magnitsky in the UK, a lawyer, but Redress are leading on this. They produced a great briefing on how to do it, and they're involved with also with the government and APPG on Magnitsky sanctions, the cross-party group. So Megan's going to talk to us about how it all works.
Thanks very much. I'll have to live up to that introduction now. Thanks very much for inviting me as well. Perhaps it's useful, at risk of telling people here what they already know, just a kind of a quick introduction to how the UK Magnitsky scheme works. I think here we're specifically talking about the human rights sanctions regime, but there is also a Magnitsky sanctions regime for corrupt practices, bribery and misappropriation. So the UK human rights regime was introduced back in 2020 by Dominic Raab with much fanfare and excitement. It essentially allows the Foreign Secretary to impose sanctions on individuals and entities, both state and non-state actors, for their involvement in serious human rights abuses. Those three violations that the regulations cover are violations of the right to life, the right to be free from torture and CIDT, and the right to be free from slavery. It's important to know, and I'm sure everybody recognises this, that the decision to sanction an actor is essentially a foreign policy decision, and it is very much at the discretion of the Foreign Secretary. Just running through some of the key points in the legislation. One is that the concept of involvement in human rights abuses is super broad. So it doesn't just cover those who are directly involved in torture, for example, so the prison guards who commit the act of torture. It also covers those who are responsible for that act, so in the chain of command, so military or police commanders, for example. It includes those who conceal evidence of abuses, those who are responsible for investigating and prosecuting but fail intentionally or recklessly to do that. It also includes those who encourage and facilitate violations and those who profit from them. So I think the potential for this regime is huge, and it really has the potential to allow the government to target the really diverse range of actors who are often involved in such entrenched, long-standing, widespread human rights abuses as we see in Bahrain. Whether it's being used to its full potential is another question, which I will come on to. There's also an appropriateness test in the legislation, so the Foreign Secretary needs to be satisfied that imposing sanctions will be appropriate, looking at the purposes of deterring and providing accountability for human rights abuses, but also the impact on the individual, so thinking about rights under the ECHR to property and family life if you're imposing asset freezes and travel bans. A side note, through the Economic Crime Act, which was passed a few weeks ago, the government introduced a new procedure or a new structure to imposing sanctions where they actually got rid of the appropriateness test for future regulations. it remains to be seen whether the existing regulations will be amended, so that test still applies for now. Then, of course, because it's a foreign policy decision, there are lots of policy factors that go into an FCDO decision on whether to impose sanctions. There's quite a helpful FCDO note on this, and so, they'll look to the scale and severity of the sanctions, whether it's, a really long-standing entrenched abuses like we've heard. The UK human rights priorities, which at present includes human rights defenders and torture, which would apply here. One thing we understand that the FCO looks closely at is the possibility of domestic law enforcement and justice mechanisms. So if there's a real culture of impunity, we understand that the FCO is less likely to act if there are ongoing proceedings that look like they may amount to something. Coordination is another big point. So Lord Ahmed, the Minister with the sanctions brief, has made clear over and over again that international coordination is at the heart of the UK sanctions policy. So it seems that they are far more likely to act if there are existing designations in key allies like the US or the EU, or it looks like it's going to go that way. What this note doesn't set out, and which Andy picked up on, is that there are obviously lots of other foreign policy considerations. So yes, these sanctions are targeted at specific actors, but what's the bilateral relationship, the trading relationships, the security relationship that obviously is going to be a driving factor in the decision-making process. From a justice perspective, we're a survivor-centred organisation, and we do think that Magnitsky sanctions have the potential to be a really powerful tool in providing accountability and deterrence for human rights abuses, such as in the cases we've been hearing about. As we all know, traditional justice mechanisms are incredibly important, but they have their downsides. They can be slow, resource-intensive. Fantastic judgments or decisions can be undermined by a lack of willingness to implement by governments. What Magnitsky sanctions allow governments to do is, if used effectively, take rapid action and impose sanctions quite quickly, as long as due process guarantees are complied with, I feel like I need to say, as a human rights lawyer. They also allow a kind of really visible and public form of accountability. We know from speaking to survivors that we work with that they are consistently, the fact that these human rights violations occurred is consistently denied. And so having a powerful government say, well, no, they did, and we're imposing sanctions on specific individuals, counters that. It also hits them where it hurts. So if people do have assets here in the UK, they send their kids to universities here, they come to Harrods and spend their ill-gotten gains, it can potentially have a real impact. Just as a side note, I want to say that we don't view Magnitsky sanctions as a perfect form of justice. They're not all accountability, and they shouldn't be used as an end in itself, but it fills that accountability gap that we find occurs in so many situations of human rights violations, when kind of all other domestic or international mechanisms have been exhausted. Kind of one really good example I want to highlight of the potential impact of sanctions is from the US. So the US designated the Rapid Action Battalion in Bangladesh in December last year. Now, they're a security force who are responsible for over 2,500 extrajudicial killings since 2009. And they also designated some linked security officials. Mixed reaction from the government, but human rights activists on the ground say that since those designations, extrajudicial killings have fallen to 0. And the Bangladeshi government has come back to the US and said, look what we've done, can you lift your sanctions now? And the US has said, well, no, good start, but we need to see some real action and accountability. This is a bit of an outlier, I must admit, but I think it shows that if they're used effectively and strategically and at the right level of seniority to a government that wants that relationship with the US or the UK to kind of exist and strengthen, then it can have real impact on the ground. Just kind of, if I may look back a little bit on what the UK has done. So the UK has imposed human rights sanctions on 75 individuals and 6 entities since the regime was introduced. The majority have been on politicians and military officials, kind of at mid-level of seniority, and it kind of goes to the question of who as an NGO do you kind of target, because who is the government likely to sanction? There have been a couple of doctors and judges and prosecutors, but they're fewer in number anyway. And the government has made some good steps, and it's fantastic that we have this regime, but there are definitely areas for improvement. So designations have slowed dramatically since the current Foreign Secretary was appointed. I think there's just been a handful of designations under the human rights sanctions regime by her and none under the anti-corruption regime. We have fallen massively out of step with the US. So for all the rhetoric that international coordination is important, we don't seem to be living up to those statements. Across the human rights and corruption regimes, the UK have designated less than 15% of those that the US has. I think the FCDO also, for good intentions, lack a very strategic approach. So we saw in relation to the sanctions in relation to the Uyghur genocide, which was fantastic, and everyone recognised that that was a really important step. Chen Quango, who was essentially the architect of the Uyghur genocide and human rights violations in Tibet, was completely left off the sanctions list, even though he was sanctioned by the US, without any explanation. And so I think missteps like that really undermine what could be effective sanctions use. And the last thing, just to pick up on what Andy mentioned, is this lack of kind of read across. Yes, it was fantastic to see those Uyghur genocide sanctions and the sanctions in relation to Khashoggi. But there are numerous instances of extremely serious and widespread human rights violations where the government seems completely unwilling to act. And sanctions should be used in all egregious cases of human rights abuses and corruption. The whole idea, and this is what Dominic Raab said when he introduced the regime, was that these should be able to be used without impacting diplomatic and trading ties with countries. So the bilateral relationship with a country, whatever that may be, should not be the driving factor in holding serious human rights perpetrators to account wherever they may be. And just as a shameless plug for Redress, we do produce a lot of materials on this, so we've published a template submission for CSOs and NGOs to use if they want to file a submission with the Foreign Office seeking sanctions. We run trainings and have various points of analysis on our website, so if anyone's here and is interested, then please do visit our website and get in touch, because we would encourage you. A final point just on the prospects of sanctions. It's so hard to tell. The FCDO is a black box. Once your sanctions submissions goes in, you have no feedback. It's really hard to know what their thought process is. But we've seen it happen, and I think with such strong advocacy campaigns and collaborations between civil societies we've got here, we can be hopeful, or cautiously optimistic, maybe. Thanks.
Isn't it? And shocking that we're very friendly with Bangladesh whilst the US is applying those sanctions. Our next speaker, Josie Tum, is the legal advocacy officer at BIRD. BIRD co-sponsored this event, the Bahrain Institute for Rights and Democracy, and as Andy says, they punch way above their weight. Anyone from Bahrain with a kind of legal issue seems to end up at Bahrain, and that's probably why Josie's been so important in documenting torture from children and adults in Bahrain over the past couple of years. And BIRD has obviously been working on it for longer than that. And she's going to talk about some of the stories, and the point is not just the individual stories like we heard from Khalid, but also the fact that the torture is systemic, which is something that we can pick up from those accounts, I think, and is reflected in the fact that both the US State Department and the Foreign Office, I believe, have published reports this month referring to human rights concerns in relation to Bahrain. Anyway, over to you, Josie.
Thank you so much to and to DPG and GCHR for organising this event and for this report as well. Yeah, it's a pleasure to speak to everybody today on behalf of BIRD. As you said, my name is Josie Tim, and since our inception as an organisation, BIRD, Bahrain Institute for Rights and Democracy, has been working to document human rights violations in Bahrain and protect and promote human rights and democratic freedoms in the country, as well as looking into the UK's role in those violations and also across the wider Gulf region. We've also been very fortunate to work quite closely with parliamentarians in the UK, such as Andy, particularly within our capacity as Secretariat of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Democracy and Human Rights in the Gulf. So as Sue mentioned, I'm going to discuss basically a couple of recent case studies of torture that BIRD has documented in the past year, in the past 12 months, unfortunately, and as well the UK government's pattern of inadequate responses to such abuse. And I think this goes back to the kind of culture of impunity that Khalid was discussing at the beginning of the event. So I'm just going to begin with an example of the abuse of detained children in Bahrain in 2021. Again, this goes back to the 10-year anniversary just over a year ago, the 10-year anniversary of Bahrain's Arab Spring and the pro-democracy uprising in the country at the time. So in February 2021, there was a wave of arrests in Bahrain, and the kind of apparent aim of this was to crush any dissent and deter protest activity among civil society in the country. So as part of this wave of arrests, at least 13 children aged between 11 and 17 were arrested and detained. So police arrested these children for allegations including burning bicycle tires, burning a chair, blocking the road, allegedly throwing a Molotov cocktail, planting a fake bomb. So the children were subjected to a range of charges, and some of them faced up to 20 years in prison. So BIRD collaborated with Human Rights Watch on a joint investigation and interviewed children and their family members. And our findings were basically that these children were detained in relation to their alleged protest activity, and that includes actually protest activity against the Formula One race in Bahrain in some cases, and also that Bahraini authorities perpetrated appalling abuses against these children. So this includes verbal and physical abuse and things like threats of rape and of electric shock. So other violations we documented included that police didn't allow parents or lawyers to be present during interrogations. Prosecutors didn't allow parents to be present when they took the children's statement or at hearings. Authorities refused to allow families to even visit children whilst they were detained. One of the children was seriously ill. He was denied medical care whilst in detention. So we found a whole litany of abuses, unfortunately, that were perpetrated against these children. And it wasn't only a series of abuse, but importantly, it was a pattern of abuse. A lot of the abuses, occurred at a specific police station in Bahrain, so Hamad Town Police Station. And the youngest child was just 11 years old. He spent his 12th birthday behind bars last year in February. So I'm not going to name any of the children for obvious reasons, but I will just quote a couple of things from some of their testimonies. So one 13-year-old said, "I was scared and I was tired. The interrogator threatened to beat me and said, 'Unless you confess, you won't leave.' Another 13-year-old said of the police officer, 'Confess that you planted a fake bomb.' I said no, so he beat me. He said, 'I will electrocute you and then you will confess.'" So Bahrain's human rights oversight bodies, which are ostensibly mandated with investigating allegations of abuse, did conduct an investigation into the cases of these children, into the torture of these children. And Bird and Human Rights Watch, in a follow-up investigation, we looked at their findings, and unfortunately, they just lacked any credibility, ignored all compelling evidence, and functioned to whitewash the abuses that the children had experienced. I'm very pleased to say that today all these children have been released from prison, but importantly, there has not been any accountability, and they haven't received any redress or compensation for what they experienced. Okay, just quickly moving on to a second case, again related to children. This is current, so we, again with Human Rights Watch, are investigating the case of 6 boys who have been arrested end of last year, beginning of this year in Bahrain. These boys were repeatedly interrogated about the presence of a lawyer or a family member, and were initially denied their rights to family visitation as well. Unfortunately, these children are still being detained in Bahrain and deprived of their right to an education. So just looking at these 2 cases, I think it's really important to consider the UK government's response and role. These cases and evidence of abuse was repeatedly brought to the attention of the UK government, the FCDO, and serious concerns by, by parliamentarians, by civil society organisations such as Bird were raised directly with the Foreign Office. When this was brought to the government's attention, unfortunately, far from raising any concerns or calling for accountability, the government failed to even acknowledge that, any allegations of abuse or that any evidence of abuse as well. The government approvingly cited the whitewash investigation into the abuses against the children, and actually referred the children back to the same oversight bodies that had whitewashed that abuse, as well as congratulating Bahrain at the same time on its child justice laws, and making inaccurate statements, publicly connecting children to their alleged crimes, and putting them actually at further risk. So I think this is just an example of, it's just one case that exemplifies the UK's really, really problematic attitude and engagement with Bahrain that, that Andy touched upon earlier as well. Okay, just one last case I'm going to quickly go through that Bird worked on last year was a mass case of a mass attack against political prisoners who were peacefully protesting in April, 17th of April 2021. We collated 7 testimonies detailing consistent allegations of torture, abuse, ill treatment and medical negligence at this time. So following an outbreak of COVID-19 in Jao prison in Bahrain in March, and the death of political prisoner who's called Abbas Malala on the 6th of April, following medical negligence against him, and alongside this, and a deterioration of prison conditions in Jao prison and punitive measures against the inmates, political prisoners held a sit-in in Jao prison, and authorities' response was unfortunately very violent. So riot police were called in to crush the sit-in. They used batons, metal rods, their shoes to beat inmates repeatedly on their heads, their ears, their eyes, hands, knees, backs, and many inmates sustained serious injuries. 2 of them were knocked unconscious. And the inmates that Bird interviewed report being dragged across the corridor, beaten, taken into a bus, beaten, insulted, and transferred to an unknown location. Their injuries were left untreated. This was also during Ramadan last year. And some inmates were handcuffed for up to a week, not permitted to make phone calls, and placed in cells with no mattresses, pillows, clean clothes. So overall, 64 inmates were subjected to enforced disappearance. And for a period of 19 days, their families were unaware of their fate. So they were held incommunicado as well, unable to contact their families or their lawyers, in clear violation of international law. And then just one individual that I'd like to name as well is Dr. Abdul Jalil Al-Singais. I'm sure many of you are familiar with his case. After over 10 years of wrongful imprisonment, today is Dr. Al-Singais' 294th day of hunger strike in Bahrain. So he's almost reached 300 days of hunger strike in protest that authorities' arbitrary confiscation of his academic research. And his case has been raised now for a decade with the UK government, who continues to fail to actually call for his release, to call upon Bahraini authorities to return his research. And so this is something that, yeah, I just like to be at the forefront of everybody's minds, because it's a particularly urgent case. And, you know, if you can contact your MP or raise it on social media, we think it's really, really important that his situation be resolved as soon as possible. So, yeah, I just bring these cases up to illustrate the ongoing use of torture and climate of impunity in Bahrain, and the kind of failure of internal mechanisms to secure any kind of redress or accountability for people who do experience human rights violations and their relatives as well. So despite the manifest abuses that the UK is aware of, the government continues its problematic funding. It's business as usual, unfortunately, with Bahrain. So the government continues to fund, to support Bahrain through the Integrated Activity Fund, which has now been replaced by the Gulf Strategy Fund. These are taxpayer-funded funding streams to the Gulf, not only to Bahrain, but to the wider Gulf, which the APPG Andy sits on, reported on last year, are lacking in transparency, accountability, and have been repeatedly implicated in the perpetration of human rights violations in Bahrain, but not only in Bahrain, also in Saudi Arabia. So this funding is still ongoing. And at the same time, the UK is looking to set free trade agreements up with the GCC, including Bahrain. There's no current indication that human rights will feature in these negotiations or in any final agreements. And the UK government, you know, in response to representations made on these kinds of cases, continues to fail to even acknowledge abuses. So that's a really major problem we're kind of confronted with, is the issue of the government stonewalling. And then, of course, there are no calls for accountability, calls for intervention, or calls for the release of political prisoners. The government kind of has a position of unwavering support, I would say, unfortunately, in the face of ongoing reports of abuse. And just one thing that did exemplify that this year was the visit of Lord Ahmad of Wimbledon to Bahrain on the anniversary of the uprising. So on the 14th of February, he went to Bahrain and then publicized his visit online on Twitter with a lot of photographs with high-level members of the Bahraini government and kind of comments praising Bahrain and its human rights. And yeah, it's obviously just extremely disappointing to see, extremely insensitive, rather than using his platform to raise any concerns or acknowledge the ongoing human rights situation in the country. It's more one of congratulating the state and kind of emphasizing the closeness of the friendship between the two nations. So that brings me to the close. I'd just like to say, if anyone would like to follow Bird on Twitter, keep updated on some of these cases, particularly the one of Dr. Asin Gais, and look at supporting calls for his release. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Josie. I should have said you're the Research and Policy Associate, and of course we can't do any of this legal work we're trying to do without excellent research, without the facts to support our cases. So this is really important, and if other people know of people in Bahrain or here who are able to speak to Bird or to others, then that's always really useful. And something else to say is you may notice tonight we don't have Bahraini human rights defenders on our panel, and that's because of reprisals which have been experienced by those who have spoken out. And so it's important to have people like Josie here to speak out on their behalf. So what's the plan? What are we going to do next? Well, from Dighton Pearce Glynn, we're hoping to write with very detailed statement and expert opinion to the Foreign Secretary and ask her to apply Magnitsky sanctions to the Minister of Interior, who we consider is responsible for the systemic torture and mistreatment of people in detention in Bahrain. And I don't want to detain you, some of you I know are fasting, too long, but if anyone has any questions before we close, I have got one question actually of Megan, given that we are planning to make our request to the Foreign Office. If you could say anything more about tactics for it to be most successful. So I know there are other NGOs and campaigning organisations here. We have an MP here. Do you think it's relevant in whose name the requests are made? Does it make sense to have one request signed off by MPs, lawyers, NGOs, or to make multiple requests? Or do you think it's more about the content of the request?
Or just to have a public campaign? Is that helpful, really, if you detail the answer?
Yeah, of course. Good question. And like I said, I wish we had more feedback from the FCDO as to what they find most helpful. I think in our experience, if there are a number of NGOs working or campaigning for sanctions in relation to the same individual, it makes sense to have one recommendation with one submission with evidence, legal arguments, policy arguments signed on by numerous NGOs and MPs to the extent that there are those who are supportive. We find in terms of engaging with the FCDO, it's helpful to try and have a conversation with the desk officer for the country in question prior to filing the submission, because once that submission's in, getting any information out of them is impossible. To the extent that you have supportive MPs like Andy who can kind of advocate publicly for sanctions, call on Minister and the Foreign Secretary in the House of Commons or any peers, that's incredibly helpful. The answer will be we don't discuss any specific sanction submissions, but at least it's raising the profile. Just trying to think of kind of more tips. I think if you can argue, I think the policy arguments are the most important and the most difficult things to articulate. We have recently filed a confidential submission in relation to a West African country with whom the UK government has a very, very strong relationship. And the way we have to frame our arguments is sanctions in this case are important not in spite of that strong relationship, but because of that strong relationship. How can you say that you are working with this country to enhance accountability within the operations of its security forces and help it with police and military reform if you don't provide or help civil society provide some form of accountability for the most egregious cases of torture or EGKs that we've seen in relation to this country? So I think publicising and articulating those policy arguments is really key.
Does anyone have any questions or contributions? No? I'm going to ask my co-speakers then just to make a final comment. Can we start? Yeah.
Thank you, and can I just thank our fellow speakers, Josie. Sue was absolutely right about Josie. She does keep us incredibly well briefed and on our toes as to redress, and we're very lucky to have, not just on the issue of Bahrain, but we're very lucky to have some fantastic human rights organisations, both the legal side, on the research side, because that's what we rely on. You know, we are here to sort of use the information that others provide, because we don't really have research facilities of our own here. The truth is, we have the House of Commons Library, and indeed they have done quite a useful brief on Bahrain just in the last few days, and we can use that. But and we do, to some extent, have within our own office a certain amount of research. But what we really need is that information from the ground, so that we can be, you know, because it's very difficult to pin down ministers. They don't want to be pinned down. And I was just thinking when I was listening to people speaking that actually this should be if for bad reasons, because of what's happening in Ukraine, this should be a very good time for being able to say to government, look, we need sanctions regimes, whatever they are, whether they're Magnitsky or whether they're economic sanctions against corporations, against oligarchs, against whole governments in that way, which they clearly have been prepared to use against countries like Iran and indeed already against Russia in some respects. And it proves that they can do this. It proves they have the tools, or they can make the tools for themselves to do this. And yet why, by contrast, as we heard from Megan, is actually the UK lagging behind? I think the honest answer is it goes back to that issue of trade. And it goes back, a word you probably didn't expect to mention here tonight, Brexit. Brexit dominates UK, not just economic policy, but foreign policy as well now. Everything must be sacrificed at the altar of trade. Blind eyes must be turned to repressive regimes because they might, in some small way, and every day there is more information about the detrimental effect that Brexit is having on our economy, and rather desperately they are searching around for trade deals, but also for ways of trying to distract from what is happening there. And they are prepared to turn a blind eye in that way. It's very difficult. And they have very formulaic responses. So if you ask questions, they will say, not just we have a very good human rights record, we have a very good record on arms trade and our export licensing, we have this, that and the other. But if you ask them, and we take all this terribly seriously, these are all formulaic responses that you get out of government, tried and tested. They will not say, they'll say that this is a country that is on our at-risk list in relation to human rights matters, and we are concerned about this, that and the other. But they never actually do anything. They never actually go further than that. And they've got all their excuses lined up in advance. So how do you tackle that? You tackle that by confronting them with some of the atrocities, the fact that there are still executions going on in Bahrain, the fact that there is torture going on there, the fact that this is collusion at the highest levels of society there, and the people who have the closest relationships here. And to do that, you need information, and you need to be able to pin that down. So just to say, information like this report, the people that you've heard tonight are invaluable in that, and more so because a lot of the actual victims and the actual human rights defenders there cannot speak up because they are cowed in one way or another, or they are under threat, or their families are under threat in that way. And this is insidious. And countries like Bahrain and some of the other GCC countries are now expert in being able to manipulate that and to say, yes, but we have an ombudsman, yes, but we have an appeal mechanism, yes, but we're working with Western countries to learn more about human rights and how we should apply them in that way. But you all know what the facts are like on the ground. It's an extra barrier, if you like. It's very much, I think, in a way, the way that the Russians work in terms of misleading, in terms of deliberately setting up smoke screens to which they hide behind. Yes, there are countries which have worse human rights records than Bahrain. Yes, there are countries that are more brazen about it in that way. But if you are on the receiving ends of those abuses, it almost says insult to injury that the people who are torturing you, who are imprisoning you, are saying to the world, hey, we're the good guys here. And that's what we must use every weapon we have at our disposal to confound and to contradict.
Do you want to say something else?
Yeah, just quickly, like what I want to say, we will continue to be the voice of the voiceless, the voice of Dr. Abdul Jalil al-Singhis, a very respected academic, the voice of Abdelaziz Khawaja, who is only in prison for his peaceful and legitimate human rights. Where can others? There are a lot of other compared to the size and population of Bahrain. And it is not just about Bahrain. We have a chronic problem across the Gulf and neighboring countries. In actual fact, this region marked with dictatorship for so long. And I have to be honest with you, one of the reasons that our people are still in prison, and the most really visible reason for the deterioration of human rights in our countries is this unconditional support that given by US and UK to oppressive governments in our region. Like the former Prime Minister David Cameron went to UAE and he was sitting with the ruling family and he said, we are a family. 100 meters from the place of his meeting, the UAE 94, a group of academics, the human rights defenders are the most reliable citizens. They were in prison and they are still in prison. So it is about really governments in the West to act, to show visibility to human rights defenders. It is not really valid to put profits before human rights, to go there to our countries, to have strong ties with oppressive governments, while in your home country you look for the highest standards of human rights. So that is a call for us, for you, to really to work together. We do our research. There is no any successful advocacy without accurate research. We will do our part in all this work, but also we have to think about new ways, some innovation, some new approach in order to have the change. I believe strongly that the change is coming, but it is slow due to a lot of factors, including this international factor and the fact that the international community is doing very little to support human rights in our countries. Thank you so much. Again.
Yeah, sorry, conscious of time, just to echo everything that was said, I think I completely agree. This is a really critical moment with the sanctions in relation to Ukraine. We've got a government that is currently proud of its use of targeted sanctions and even amended primary legislation to make sanctions easier. So I think it's the right time to be pushing for these other types of sanctions and asking the government to put its money where its mouth is.
It's about fairness. You have to say something.
Thank you. I'll keep it very quick. Thank you so much to everybody, particularly DPG and GCHR. I think, if there is going to be any accountability, it will be through collaboration between parliamentarians, between CSOs, between human rights defenders and people on the ground. And I think that's why this event is so important and this report is so important and is really encouraging to see. So what Andy was saying about it being difficult to pin down ministers and not get template responses out of the FCDO. Like if it's difficult for you, Andy, it would be for sure impossible for us. So I think it's great to see everybody coming together today and positive for moving forward. Thank you.
I hope that we'll be able to remember tonight as the start of successfully pursuing a Magnitsky sanction, or if not, putting more pressure on the government about Bahrain and bringing it into the public domain. And the words of Abdullah Hadi al-Khawaja, who is still in jail, are that you don't succeed in a human rights struggle in a few years, it takes a lifetime. So we're conscious that this is a long struggle, and every meeting and every intervention is just a small step in that struggle. And I hope that if you have any thoughts or ideas or information, that you'll get in touch with us at Dighton Pearce Glynn, and thank you so much everyone for all your support.
Thank you.